Hi, I'm Pastor Steve Talmage of Love of Christ Lutheran Church, and each week, Pastor Nanette Christofferson and I like to provide a brief introduction to upcoming Bible readings. I'd like to give an introduction to the Gospel assigned for Christ the King Sunday for November 22nd, 2020. It's Matthew 25, 31 to 46. I encourage you to read through that passage before listening to this lesson if possible, just to get some familiarity with it. This is a familiar passage, and we often hear it on Christ the King Sunday in November. It's called the parable of the sheep and the goats, and it really is a word of judgment of the nations. And as we come to the end of Jesus' teaching before his final days of Holy Week, this section applies to God's judgment upon those who are not already believers or followers of Jesus. The nations. That's who they're called, the nations. Matthew follows the Jewish tendency to distinguish non-Jewish nations and Israel as God's people. That distinction is sometimes reflected in the word nations, or often translated as Gentiles. The nations here are in contrast with God's people and the little ones who belong to Jesus. In Matthew 18, the phrase little ones hovers between children and adults who believe in Jesus, who become like children. The parable speaks of a surprising way of the unbelieving nations having a relationship with Jesus. What they do to these little ones, they do to Jesus. Jesus' word is a promise that creates what it declares. Jesus makes these little ones who suffer and are broken the place of his presence in the world, even for those who do not believe in him or know about it. This is one way that Jesus creates salvation for those who do not even know him. Those who do believe in Jesus know that he is present in the little, insignificant, whose suffering Jesus took into himself through his suffering and death. This we await and are ready. At the same time, those who believe in Jesus as they hear this word from him need to guard against the temptation to use the need of others to achieve salvation rather than seeing it as a gift of Jesus' presence. A question. Because this parable seems to indicate there is salvation for those who do not confess Jesus as Lord, why do we bother sharing the good news of Jesus? First, those who are ministering are not doing it for any payoff or reward. Second, we need to ask why. Why are we so threatened if Jesus chooses to bring salvation to those outside the patterns we have been taught or inherited? As you read this parable, for some, this parable raises all sorts of discomfort and questions. Many of us have had the experience of having our kindness or generosity exploited. Some of us have spent a lifetime trying to break free from codependent relationships. Others of us are tempted to see this parable as contradicting our understanding of being saved by grace, not works. But here, human works are praised. Again, we need to remember the ones doing the compassionate acts in the story are surprised. They are surprised by any blessing or word of praise their act of kindness generates. Something else seems to drive them to love their neighbor as themselves. Notice also in this story, the righteous, those called righteous, do not earn the kingdom, but they inherit it. Inheritance can only be determined by the giver, not the receiver. A word about sheep and goats. Ancient people drew moral analogies from the habits of sheep and goats. Sheep were intelligent, yet quiet animals, submissive, yet persistent. Male sheep fiercely protected their harems from challengers. Sheep arranged themselves in a herd. In the face of danger, the adult males would surround the females and the young. In a culture that encouraged loud debate and social one-upmanship, contemporaries of Jesus admired sheep for their loyalty and silent strength. Goats, however, were stubborn, destructive animals if left unattended. Male goats did not protect their mates from other males. The name goat became a derogatory term for a man shamed by the adultery of his wife. In folklore of the general Greek culture, the goat symbolized the loose morals of lesser gods like Pan, Bacchus, or Aphrodite. So Jews hated the symbol of the goat, for it represented a disobedient, undisciplined lifestyle. Separation of the people, of the sheep and goats, is not our responsibility. Separation happens before people are told what they have done. Dr. Robert Smith helps us see this passage as a window into the passion narrative that will follow when he writes, "Indeed, the great and final vision of 25 verses 31 to 46 prepares readers for the passion narrative that will be read in chapters 26 through 27. In his vision, Jesus speaks about being identified with the world's outcasts. And in his passion, he actively and actually identifies with them. The Son of God stands deliberately and voluntarily in the shoes of the powerless, the weak, the defenseless, the hated, the tortured. He began as a refugee in Matthew's gospel, and he ends as a condemned criminal. He gave his blood for them and many. Who are the least of these, my brothers? Is it a reference to believers in Jesus? Is it a reference to all human beings in need? Or is it a reference to both? Scholars debate. What is important to note, as Dr. Thomas Long writes, the shock of the parable is that no one, not the goats and not even the sheep, recognized Christ because they assumed that the majestic, triumphant Lord of all time would surely appear as a powerful presence in history. But as this parable indicates, this is not God's way in the world. So, what might we take away from this parable? One of my seminary professors, Dr. Richard Jensen, wrote, in Jesus' eschatological vision, that end of the world vision, we discover that when Jesus does come into our heart, he brings all of needy humanity along with him. May you have a blessed week, and may God prepare you to worship this coming Sunday as you meditate on the parable of the sheep and the goats. God bless.